Good afternoon, aficionados. Could be good morning too, I guess, or even good evening. We're once again on the road. Here we are inside Streetwork Exotics and up in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. Fantastic restoration facility. I'm here. This conversation is actually going to be a lot of fun because I'm here with John Ling. And John and I go back to the 1970s.
Wow, way back. Yeah, 70s.
How did we meet? Do you recall?
I had a Bizzarini, and you were starting the ESO Bizzarini Owners Club.
Yikes.
I don't even know how you found me.
Because I'm wondering, so back in the old days, when there were publications with newsprint, I'm wondering if it might have been we placed an ad in Hemmings.
I might have answered it.
Exactly.
Because I didn't know there was a club. I would have been very happy to hear that there was.
Yeah, and so we were starting the whole thing up. John has a fantastic automotive resume because at one time you owned the restoration shop that was predecessor to Streetworks.
Correct.
John, when I was first asked to be a judge at Pebble Beach in 1989 as a chief class judge, and I said to the organizers, okay, you're going to provide the field judges? And they said, no, you have them. You got to get them. John was my first phone call. You were my first phone call. Yep. You have a very interesting story on how you got into cars. It's not the usual, well, my parents had them or something like that, of how you got into cars back in the day.
You mean growing up?
Yes.
Well, we lived in a suburb of Los Angeles called Brentwood, and there was a number of celebrities lived there, and of course they liked to drive exotic cars, what were exotic in those days. And so I had a history of seeing exotic cars as a small child, as much as I saw regular American sedans, and they just seemed so interesting to me, and it got me into cars and into exotic cars.
And then you were pestering your dad to try and get something like that.
For his whole life. Poor guy bought American his entire life. And he just could not bring himself to buy. He bought a Buick Riviera. He bought a T-Bird. But that's as close as he could get to anything that was remotely unusual.
But it was, so who were the neighbors on your sides?
Well, we had a number of neighbors that had interesting cars. Robert Mitchum lived behind us and 2 doors down. And he drove an Aston Martin, which of course I had never heard of as a child. I thought it was so interesting because I could hear it coming down the street, which you didn't hear American cars coming down the street. And others, Ed Wynn, the comedian up the street from us, he had Ferraris and Maseratis and Frank Sinatra's arranger and composer, Sonny Burke. When Sinatra came over, he was driving the
Dual Ghia.
A Dual Ghia.
Yes.
Because
that was the Rat Pack car.
Yeah. And a little later, my brother was dating a girl when he was in high school, and they lived next door to Dean Martin. And of course, he had a number of interesting cars, Ghia L6.4, and so we'd see those parked in his driveway. So it was just growing up seeing cars that you didn't get to see otherwise in magazines.
So this was early 60s?
Well, this goes back to the 50s even.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you were originally born where?
L.A.
And then you went to Wisconsin, then came back?
When I was 10, we moved to Wisconsin, and when I was 15, we moved back.
And your father
14,
was...
actually.
Yeah, your father was a screenwriter.
Correct, before Wisconsin.
Yes.
Okay.
You move on back. Where'd you go to school? Because I'm assuming schoolmates must have had some good stuff.
Yeah, when I moved back, I went to Loyola High School in Los Angeles. The schoolmates didn't have... I don't remember too many that had good cars. Only the few that were actors. The kid that was on the Danny Thomas show, he drove a Cobra.
No kidding.
At 16, yeah. The fellow that was on Fury, what did he have? He had some interesting car. and the guy that was on the Rifleman.
Oh, the kid?
Yeah. What was his name?
I'm forgetting the actor's name anyhow.
Yeah, well, they all went to the same high school, and they all had better cars than the rest of us, of course, because they had much better jobs. So, but no, for the most part, I don't remember too many of the kids, even the rich kids, that had anything exotic in high school. By college, that was another whole story, of course.
For instance?
Oh, well, for instance, I drove Lotus and Ferrari in college. So, I mean, I had exotic cars by then, and I was just in college. So
now we're going back to the real old days when things were, I mean, real interesting stuff.
They were just used cars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And stuff today it's worth millions, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars.
Oh, the Ferrari I drove in college, a Berlina short wheelbase, that I paid $62.50. I traded my Lotus in on it for the Lotus and $24.50. So I paid $64.50 for the car, and that's easily a $10 million car today. It's a Berlina short wheelbase race car, and it was mint. It was just a mint used car in those days.
Yeah, and then how long did you have that?
Only about a year and a half, because I broke my back about a year and a half after I.
But then it's great because of that. You traded for something else.
Yes, I had to get something that I could get in and out of in a cast, in a full body cast. So, I traded it for an Intermechanica.
It was an Apollo, right?
Apollo,
yeah.
Yes. But when the doctor saw that, he didn't like that either. He said, that's the same car you just had. And so I traded that for an ESO Revolta, which turned out to be great. It had a wide door. It had wide seats. It was automatic. And so I had that for a couple of years until I recovered from all of that. That was my first interest in my first knowledge of ESOs.
But it's crazy because when we look at what you went through, Lotus, which you bought new, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, two of them. I bought a Lotus Europa when they came out. That was my first new car, and it turned out to be defective. So we had to sue the dealer or the importer, and they took it back and gave me a new Elan, which was a more expensive car. So I took it, and I loved that. I put 40,000 miles on it in 14 months.
Wow.
So drove that everywhere. Palm Springs every weekend. We just had a great time in that. I don't know how I got through college in those days, but it was so much fun with that car. And then I went to work for the Italian mechanic, and he didn't like the Lotus parked in front of his shop every day. So he's the one that convinced me to get a Ferrari from him.
So where John's talking about is a gentleman named Sal Di Natale, and his shop was Italian sports cars.
S&A Italia
That's
sports
right.
cars. Sal and Anna, his wife.
And this place was like the place back then.
Yes. Oh, yes. When Sal came to the U.S., he came over here. He landed in New York, and he had one of the Alfa Romeo bats.
Yes.
One of the famous bats. And he, with his wife and two babies, one in each door, because the doors were quite wide, drove across country to L.A., to settle in L.A. And I first met him with an actor friend of mine who was into racing Ferraris. We happened to break down in one of his cars right in front of a Chevron station. And the guy that had the station said, "Oh, I have a mechanic working here that can probably fix this." And it was Sal. And he was working, and he didn't speak English too well yet. And Peter's car had never run as well as when we came back and picked it up. It's just unbelievable. And then the club got a hold of him, because Peter was part of the club, Ferrari Owners Club, and they kind of helped set him up in business.
But that's kind of crazy, particularly back in the day when you were lucky to stumble across anyone like that.
Or anyone that could work on them at all. Because in those days, the people that worked on them were really the mechanics in the dealerships that raced them. So,
did you ever spend any time at Von Neumann's store?
I was there, but he wasn't convenient to where we lived.
Okay.
John Von Neumann, you're talking about?
Yeah, Johnny von Neumann.
Yeah. He was out in the valley, and we were in the west side of L.A.
That's right. So von Neumann.
We had Auto Zipper.
Okay.
And then Estes Zipper later.
Oh my God, some of these names.
I know.
Because then Estes went and became a Lamborghini dealer.
Yes.
And all that type of craziness. Johnny von Neumann was the West Coast distributor for Ferrari back in the day.
Yes.
And then Canetti was handling the East.
And eventually Porsche.
Oh, that's right.
Yes. I had a Porsche America Roadster that was raced by his daughter, Josie von Neumann, back in 51, 52. So he was also Volkswagen and Porsche importer. Yikes.
And then you worked with Sal for quite a while.
During college, yeah. So I could afford to drive the car that he had sold me.
So did he sell you the short wheelbase, or was it?
Well, he would go over to Italy in August every year and bring back cars for customers. He would literally go shopping, and he actually went over there one year, and he brought back the Berlinetta that I had and a GTV 4Cam, which was a brand new car, had just come out, and he brought him back for the Pontiac dealer in North Hollywood, who was a car aficionado, and so they were on his showroom, and he was only going to keep one of them. So Sal said, "You should go over and look at them and see if you want one." Well, I couldn't possibly afford the newer one, but the older one was right in my price range. So, and he took my Lotus in trade-in. They sort of misread the mileage on it.
What do you mean?
Well, it was only a year old, but it had 42,000 miles on it. They thought it was 4,200 when his mechanics glanced in the car to see how many miles were on it. He must have assumed it was 4,200 because they gave me a $4,000 trade-in on a car that was only about 5,800 new. So they were not happy about it when I heard about it later. They found out it was 42,000 miles. But meanwhile, I already had the Ferrari, and they weren't going to get it back. So,
and I'm assuming you must have kept it in mint condition to.
Oh, sure, and especially working for Sal. I mean, I blew a head gasket once. It's the only thing that ever happened to it, and of course, I had to work overtime for him to get that fixed.
Boy, but what's impressive though, because you hear so many horror stories about Lotus and their reliability, but you had no issues.
Not with the Elan. The Europa was when I got it. It had just come out. I got one of the first 50 cars. The windows didn't open. They weren't supposed to yet. They were waiting for kits to come to make them open. So, and I fell for that they were going to get the kits. I don't know if they ever did, but it didn't matter. The whole car was leaning to one side, and I didn't realize it until I started working for a English mechanic first, Terry Nickel, in Encino, and he did mostly Rolls, Bentley, Jaguar, and Aston Martin. And so he mentioned me one day when I drove in. He says, "What's wrong with your car?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, it's leaning to one side when you got out of it." I looked, and it was. If I got in it, it kind of straightened out, but that's not supposed to be that way. So he told me, he put it up on the lift, and he started measuring, and he said, this is this frame they have in it, which was a sheet metal frame. He said, "It's all been drilled wrong." He says, I can't even fix this. He said, "You need a new frame." So I took it back to the dealer where I got it, and they tried to tell me that it was supposed to straighten out when I sat in it. I said, no, I don't think so. So they didn't have lemon laws in those days, so I had to call my father's lawyer, and he said, "Take it back, drop it off, and we'll handle it from there." So I delivered it back to them, and 6 months later, right before the trial, they settled and gave me a new Lotus Elan, which was a fabulous car.
I believe it.
Good car. Way different than the Europa was with its Renault engine and whatnot.
Yeah, it was now really both cars, but in particular the Elan went right with good old Colin Chapman's. It was simplified, then add lightness, if I'm remembering correctly.
And in fact, the Europa eventually became a very good car when they started putting the twin cam engine in it, and they made it into a much better car than when it came out. I don't know what the deal with Renault was, but it was not a great engine and trans in it at that point.
It's God, when you just think about, because back in the day, there were so many cars that were unreliable, and now it's like almost everything works.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that car only had a 6-month warranty. 6 months, 6,000-mile warranty, I think, if I remember right. And my warranty was up when the transmission went out on it shortly after I bought it. It had a split-case transmission that had been misaligned when they machined it, and all the oil went out. I didn't know it, and I lost the transmission. And then they spent almost 6 months fighting with Renault over whether Lotus or Renault was going to supply the new transmission. And when they finally decided who was, there was a dock strike in France. So my warranty was up. I only had 1,000 miles on the car. That's all I'd ever driven it. So, but I was glad it was gone, and I loved the Lotus. And of course, I loved the Ferrari even more. You know.
And so you've gone through so much stuff over the years.
Oh, that was just the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, because even if we're looking behind us, okay, so directly behind me is Maserati Sebring. How many of those have you had?
3. First one I bought from Tommy Smothers, the Smothers brothers, which had a bad engine, I might add, which he never did anything about. I wasn't happy with him.
And then the other two?
The other two were, the first one I had was a Series 1. The second one was a Series 1. And it was in really nice condition. I just bought it as a driver. And the third one was like this, a Series 2. And didn't really restore it. I think we repainted it. That was about it. Yeah. And I just drove. They were nice driving cars. They're short wheelbases as Maseratis go. So they just perform better. And two of the ones I had were 3.5 liters, and the last one I had was a 4 liter. Huge difference in performance.
Oh, I could imagine.
So that was really nice.
Yeah,
and 5 speeds, which is nice. A lot of the other Maseratis of that era were still 4 speeds.
It's but when you just look at what were in quotes used cars, and that what were you paying for those things, like $4,000?
Oh, yeah. Well, in fact, the one I got from Smothers, I think, was even less. I think it was $3,000. The second one was about $5,000, and the last one I got was later, so it was up around $9,000 or $10,000 by then.
Yeah. Next, we had Maserati Bora. You've had one of those?
I've had one of those, a silver one, and that's probably one of the nicest cars Maserati ever built. Just a dream to drive.
What makes you say that?
Oh, the mid-engine, the handling is unbelievable. The V8 engine is just smooth as glass and very reliable. And again, a nice 5-speed ZF transaxle, 4-wheel disc brakes. They have a little bit of the Citroen equipment in them, so they have the hydraulic suspension and steering and whatnot. It was just a nicely designed car. Really comfortable seats.
Oh, yes, because I have long been a proponent of Maserati Boras.
Oh,
because
a bargain.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And then when you compare it to a Countach or Boxer, its contemporaries, you get in one of these that's tight, it makes those things feel antiquated.
Yeah.
Because ride, how quiet it is.
More comfortable.
Yes.
Easier to get in and out of even.
Yes.
In the modern cars, yeah.
And then next to that, we've got an Iso Grifo.
Ooh, I've had a few of those. Isos, I've had many of all of them. I've had
oh, that's right.
2 LAs, 1 Fidia, 3 Revoltas, and probably 4 or 5 Grifos.
And if memory serves me correctly, you bought the Fidia off of the dude that was the producer, the director of the original Gone in 60 Seconds.
Oh, yes. And that's exactly right. The fellow who produced that movie. And he loved that car, and it was mint. He had just kept it mint, and it was late, so it had the Ford engine in it, the Ford running gear. And I think that's the one I sold to
Piero Revolta.
Yes.
Yes.
That's in his collection now.
Yes.
Of cars that were built by his family.
Yes. So for those that don't know, ISO was a Ferrari, Maserati, and Lamborghini competitor, their own proprietary, very sophisticated chassis with American engines for reasonable horsepower and reliability.
And cost.
Yes. And it was just, they were phenomenal cars. I mean, that was my introduction to exotic cars.
Yes, and a great one it was. If I hadn't got that original Revolta, because of the broken back and the body cast, I probably never would have known about them. I would have known about them. I saw them in the magazines, but I wouldn't have really thought much about them. I would have probably continued on with V12 Ferraris and straight six Maseratis, but they were a dream.
Yeah. Yeah, and then behind the small block Griffo, we have a big block Griffo. I don't recall you owning a big block Griffo.
No. Never had a big block.
Yeah. And then over here, we've got De Tomaso Mangusta. Have you ever owned any De Tomaso?
Good question. Yes. Well, it took me a second to remember. For a second, I was forgetting the name of it. I had a Vella Lunga.
That's what I thought.
Which I took in trade on another car. I didn't even know what it was. And it turned out to be a dream of a little race car that I never got to race it, but it was just a beautifully designed car with a small 4-cylinder engine, a mid-engine, and just a neat car. Also designed, I believe, by Giugiaro, the body on it.
He did not do the Valley Lunga. I think that was Fasori that did that.
Oh, could be.
Yeah.
Could be. It looked like something he would have done, though. It was very nice looking.
But that was just so classic of that time where everyone was doing right proportions and swoopy fenders.
Oh, yeah. And they could do them in small quantity and still not go bankrupt too quickly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So did you bounce around much between other countries, or were you just primarily an Italian car guy?
No, I had a number of other cars, German, French, English. But the Italians, I always thought, were the most interesting.
Why?
Oh, they went to more lengths to have something that was really stylish. There wasn't, the Germans were more practical. Like, I wouldn't call even a 911 Porsche, or certainly a 356 Porsche, to be stylish. It's very practical. It's very aerodynamic. It's very, you get room in it, but it's not drop dead gorgeous like some of the Italian cars. And other than the XKE, pretty much the same of the English cars, they were pretty conservative, particularly things like Bristol and Jaguar sedans and the like. But still nice cars. It still made very nice cars. I drive Jaguars today as modern cars just because they're very practical. And then French, I love the Fossil Vegas. I've had a number of those, both Facilia and the big Fossils. And then also I've had a number of Citroen SMs. The only Citroen I haven't any of the other Citroens, but the SMs I just love. I've gone through. I think I'm on my 9th one now. So I've had one consistently, at least one, for the last 20 years, probably. So
I did not know that you've because I know you've gone through them, but I didn't realize that was like the one constant.
Yep. Sometimes I've had as many as 2 or 3 at a time, but always at least one.
John likes to punish himself sometimes.
True.
It's so for those that don't know, Citroen SM was a very avant-garde car, introduced in 1970, if I'm remembering correctly.
Correct.
Maserati V6 up front. It was one of the reasons Citroen bought Maserati in 1968, was to be able to get access to the engine and their engineering capabilities. 2-door aerodynamic body, but done in a very French way. It's not like the Italian curves and sleekness.
No, it's real aerodynamic. It looks way ahead of its time. When you look at it for 1970, it looks like something that was designed in the 90s at the earliest.
Yes.
So just a timeless design, as many Citroens are actually.
And then with the air suspension, so when you fire it up, boom, up it comes. So it's very cush and comfy, 140-mile-an-hour car. And if memory serves me correctly, it was voted Car of the Year. I think both
Motor
in
Trend.
Europe and
Yes.
the U.S.
Yes, it was, and it deserved it. It was so different. It did things that other cars still don't do to this day. You know, one of their great promotions when they were selling them was when you go into the dealer, they would show you a little video they had in a small video machine, but where they driver is driving one on a French racetrack. It's in a straight line, and he gets up to 100, I believe 100 miles an hour, and a marksman shoots the front tire out, and the driver puts both hands on the ceiling and hits the brakes, and the car stops dead straight.
Wow.
Yeah, because it had the power steering that straightened when you let go of it, and it did not change, and the car stayed level even if you lost a wheel completely.
Wow.
Because of the pneumatic suspension would compensate for that not being there, and it would give more pressure to the other sides to make it stay level. It was a great video. I had one once, but unfortunately, it was a weird machine that went in. We couldn't play it in anything else, and the machines disappeared.
I wonder if you can find that on YouTube.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
I'll bet you could.
Yeah.
It was a great promotion. It isn't even the reason I was interested. I didn't see that video till long after I had my first one, but they were the first car to have variable ratio power steering, and it was so variable ratio that at parking it was 2 3/4 turns, and at 55 miles an hour it was 1 turn lock to lock.
Wow.
Full Formula One steering.
Yeah.
Just nobody else tried to do this. And I can't say they were very successful. It cost them a lot to make the cars, and they didn't sell enough of them to make money on them. So it probably wasn't a profitable venture for them.
No, and then if I'm remembering correctly, in 1975, Citroen let go of Maserati.
Oh yeah, and they almost got bankrupt owning Maserati. Yes, because they had no idea how to run Maserati.
Yes.
And other than getting the engine from them, they never really connected with them on anything else for their other cars. So, and Maserati was for sale because it was bankrupt to begin with. So they bought a company that wasn't doing well, and they weren't able to make it do any better. So if it hadn't been for Michelin buying them, they probably would have gone under because of buying Maserati.
It was also a really hinky time because you had there was a lot of economic and political and social strife over in Europe, particularly against cars like this, because you really had a movement towards socialism.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and so any type of show, particularly in France, where there was, if I'm remembering the term correctly, there was the embarrassment of wealth. If you showed anything that was wealth, it was almost like shame.
Yeah. And it was the same time that Great Britain was having their huge labor problems, which is why their cars were not getting made very well. They just had giant strikes and labor problems going on in all the car factories. And it's such a shame because it's the reason that XKEs, which are such a great car, were very poorly assembled. So, and they're famous for it.
Did you ever own any other British stuff? Jensen, because you mentioned Bristol earlier, Rolls or Bentley or
I've had quite a few Bentleys, Bentley Continentals especially. I had a
1960s
R-Type Continental, which was from 52.
Yeah. Yep.
Then I had a 56 S-Type Continental. And then I had an S2 Continental, which would have been like 1960. I had 2 of those coupes. I like the Continentals especially. And then I had one S2 regular 4-door sedan. And
it's just all kind of custom coachwork type stuff.
Oh yeah, the custom coachwork always interested me more than the production cars. I also had a Rolls, or actually I take it back, a Bentley, a turbo from the 80s.
Yes.
And then I had a Corniche coupe, but they weren't as interesting as the Continentals were with the aluminum bodies, and there where they actually tried to make them perform a little better than the standard cars. So
Yeah, it was just good.
They looked so good.
Oh yeah, and they were
cars.
just used cars. You're probably paying $5,000 to $20,000 or something.
Nothing. Yeah, they were. In fact, when I bought the R-Type Continental, I bought it from the guy who a retired airline pilot up in Carmel, California. He was retired from Pan Am, and he was restoring them himself in his own garage. That was his hobby. And he finished it. He showed it at a couple of concourses, including the one in L.A., and then he sold it. Move on to the next one. He liked restoring them. He didn't care about having the cars.
Yeah.
So, and I think I paid $7,250 for it, $7,250 for it. And then when I sold it, I think I got $9,500 for it. I was ecstatic because I actually first car that I'd ever made money on because I didn't do anything to it. He had already restored it.
Yeah.
And I showed it once at the LA Auto Show. They asked for it to be in the lobby with a couple of other cars just to show some interesting old cars and with all the new cars. I never showed it in a concours because it had already been in the only concours in LA. So, but it was a neat car to drive. It was just such a dream to drive, a fastback. And that car just actually recently sold for, I think, $1.9 million at the place in New York.
That's it, because I was going to guess about $2 million for that.
Yeah. So they've gone up a little.
Yeah, back when they were just cars.
Well, I know, but that's what was so great. You could buy these and drive them and insure them.
Yes.
And how do you insure a $1.9 million car today? I mean, insurance company would laugh at you. You want $1.9 million insurance on it? Yeah, that'll cost you $100,000 a year, maybe $150,000 a year. So you can't do it.
Well, and the other thing that was great was once you got into cars, and particularly this type of stuff, for me, it was almost like you were hiding in plain sight with life's greatest secret.
Oh, yes. I couldn't believe I couldn't believe I could own these cars. And so in nice condition even, not just junky cars. I mean, cars that were mint original or that have been restored and for just peanuts.
And something, Matt, you're over there. Okay, so I'm seeing out of the corner of my eye, something you'll relate to, which we can certainly relate to, is we know what they felt like when they were, in quotes, new or near new, because they were just used cars. They hadn't been tinkered with, because when you had you sold your restoration shop maybe too long ago for this to really happen. But this is something Matt can certainly relate to, is when someone comes in and the car doesn't drive that well, and they just assume that's the way it drove back in the day because it was old, and they don't know any better. And it's like, no. You don't understand. These things really drove nicely.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I mean, it was so unusual when we would do things like when I hate to date myself, but when radial tires came out. It's funny because that's all there are today. But anyway, when radial tires came out, to switch those Bentleys to radial tires made a world of difference. Before they kind of wandered down the road because they didn't have the tightest steering in the world, and those tires were not very grippy. And all of a sudden, they drove 100% better. And the same thing when you had them on, when you put them on your Aston Martin that came with bias ply tires also, or early ones in the 50s. You change over to the tires, and all of a sudden the car just drove like a different car. I remember the first time I put some Goodyear NCTs on the Iso Grifo I had at the time. Mm-hmm. Bang, all of it. I mean, it was already a really nice driving car, but now it's even that much more on the road. Better, yep.
Yeah, that.
It was sort of like when as the years went by, they came out with better and better stereos because the original radios were a joke. I mean, you had one speaker somewhere hiding in the car somewhere, and all of a sudden you had stereo speakers, and you had, and they were actually putting out stereo music over the airwaves, and of course the first car that I had anything in, that Ferrari Berlinetta short wheelbase, came with an Italian 8-track in it. First time I'd ever had an 8-track, and I didn't even know I had no idea what it was. I had to go to Madman Months to get the 8-track tapes.
Oh my God, there's a name out of the past.
Yeah. I had no idea where do you get tapes for this, but it was an Italian unit, and it took 8 tracks, and I couldn't believe it. It had 2 speakers. I had stereo in the Ferrari. Couldn't hear it because the car was so loud, but it was there.
Yeah,
it was sort of like when I remember when working at Harry Woodnorse. Bill Cosby bought a Cobra something snake.
Oh, he bought one of the 2 Super Snake.
Yes, Super Snake. That's what it was. And he bought it from Shelby, and he brought it into Harry, and he wanted to know if Harry could put some music in it, because it had no radio at all. It was quite loud. It had huge pipes on the side, and they were loud. They were ridiculous. So Harry stuck me with the job of, what can you do with this? And of course, by then I knew about Madman Months, so I took it over to Madman Months, and they put an 8-track player in the dash with 2 portholes, to plug in headphones, which had just come out. Koss headphones had come out for stereos at home.
Yeah.
And Crosby would drive down the road in this Super Snake Cobra with him and his wife with headphones on, listening to music. And it worked great because you couldn't, if you put speakers in, you wouldn't have heard him anyway. It was so loud. He was happy as a clam, and nobody was using headphones, so they weren't illegal yet. Today they're illegal to wear headphones. But
see, this is another great thing about growing up in Southern Cal back in the day, because it really was one of the automotive meccas.
Oh, yeah.
And then you had this meshing with show business.
Yeah. They had money to burn, and they liked things that were different.
Yeah.
Things that were exotic. Cosby had a huge collection of cars. Everything I think he ever owned, he kept. He had them at his farm in Massachusetts. He had them he had a rental unit in Van Nuys where he kept his cars. And he was a real car buff. Big customer at Scott's shop.
Oh, that's interesting.
Today.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. We restored he had 2 Porsche Speedsters that he bought new back in the day. And he kept them both, drove them into the ground, and then restored them.
Nice.
And he had a 300 SL that he had since the Chicago days, way back, that he bought new, a Roadster, and we restored that. But yeah, it was what was so fun about the whole thing. And the restoration business in L.A. would have been fabulous. I really enjoyed it when I met Scott. He became a good friend, and eventually I ran his shop for him for a while when he got sick.
I remember that.
And then sold it, and then he went back into the business later on. But his shop, he had 39 employees. It was huge. It's the biggest restoration shop I've ever seen. And it overwhelmed him. It was too much. It wasn't what he wanted. His shop foreman basically built the business around him.
Yeah, he was more just an artisan.
Oh, my God. But the celebrities that came in there, and they would come in with new cars, and they wanted something done different. I want my car different, They wanted him to rebody, like a Datsun Z car or something, to make it look different, to make it different. And it was a strange business. You're restoring cars, and at the same time you're modifying new cars for the people that just have more money to burn and can't think of anything else to do with it. So,
out of all the stuff that you've owned over the decades, are there any 2 or 3 that really stick out? And if so, A, what are they? And B, why? What made them so special or memorable to you?
Well, the Citroen SMs, of course. That's why I've had so many of them for so long. I've just never found another car that did as much as those did. They were that far advanced in so many different ways: suspension, brakes, steering. Actually, oddly enough, their weakest points probably the Maserati V6 engine, because you can't really get much more out of it than they already have gotten out of it. But that and Boy, I've had so many. Monteverde, Fossil Vega. I always liked the one-off stuff.
Yeah.
Things that were very rare and that were built one-off. And things like Monteverde, which had Chrysler engines, and
Swiss
same with Fossil
manufacturing,
Vega,
yeah.
Chrysler engines. It was nice to have cars that were that exotic looking, and yet you didn't have to spend your whole paycheck to tune them, you know. So
Yeah, and the Monteverdes were great too because that big, heavy chassis they had was
beautifully made.
Yes.
Yeah. The bodybuilders, Ferrari, and who was the other one? They just did fabulous work.
Because the first gen 375S was Frua.
Frua
and then Vasari was the second gen.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember because I definitely remember your second gen 375S, silver with tan interior,
which was the first one I owned. The second one I had was a blue, but also with a tan interior, navy blue.
I barely remember because I thought you had a first series 375S.
Yes, I did, and I had the second series first.
Yes,
first series second. And actually, I like this. I like the second series better. I think possibly the first series might have looked better. The second series had kind of what they called the fish nose, but the second series was more comfortable. It had more ergonomics on the inside. It just was a better overall car.
And then you also had the prototype Isogrifo.
I did. I had that for a number of years, both unrestored and later on restored. And it was interesting. It's the kind of car that you have as a collection, but you can't really have it to drive because they designed the car to have gee whiz effect, more or less. You know, they wanted people to buy them because they looked so super. But in fact, to do that, they weren't very practical. Like it had no air conditioning and nowhere to put it in the car. It had the seats. I was tight in the car, and I was even smaller then, but I'm not very big. But a person like your size wouldn't fit in it at all.
No, that's not true.
Literally.
Because I remember driving that thing.
Oh, I know, but I'm sure you were like this, and you'd have to be.
Yes.
My head was on the ceiling, and there's no up and down to the seats.
No.
They just went back and forth, and they bottomed in the back with my knees up against the steering wheel.
Yeah.
So you would have to be, you could drive it, but I'm just saying, when they went to production, they changed everything. They just made it so different because it was also more or less mid-engine.
Front mid-engine.
Like the Pizzarini's front mid-engine, yes. So they put that engine way back, and that made very little room for the passenger and the driver. But it looked spectacular.
Oh, yes.
With its side pipes, and polished stainless, and the shark nose. They kind of kept that, but they couldn't keep it entirely because they found that it lifted the car at speed. With that, they weren't into spoilers in those days on the front, so it was like having an air dam lifting you up as you're going faster and faster.
Yes.
So they had to change that, but it was a great-looking car. But the more I drove it, the less I liked it as far as a driver.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's why I finally sold it, in fact, because I had restored it, I had shown it, and now it was like, what do I do with it now? Because it's not that great to drive.
Because the memory that I have of driving that car, and it was pre-restoration, was, boy, you could sense the potential. And then that's what, boom, green one there, is what it became. And then it was, when the Griffo came out, it was widely lauded as one of the best, if not the best car in the world. The best GT car.
And it deserved it. I mean, they made mechanicals that were easy to come by, not just the engine and trans. The differential was used in various other cars, the brakes, the steering. None of it was exclusive to the car and therefore ridiculously expensive. And you add to that the fact that now almost everybody could fit in one. I mean, they now actually had space. They had a trunk that actually took a couple of suitcases, before the trunk was taken up by the spare tire and the jack. That was about all you could fit in it. in my A3L. So they really made it a practical GT car, and it was a great GT car.
Oh, yes.
It is today.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because Griffo's, it's been one of kind of the stealth markets over, I'm going to say, the past 7 to 10 years, because now probably double the price of a Ghibli.
Yeah, they shot up.
Yeah.
They shot past Ghibli, which is interesting because the Ghibli is a fine car too, and I'm always amazed that the Ghibli sort of languished, just like the Bora languished even more, but the Ghibli got passed by the Isogriffo. I never thought that would happen just because of the more exotic engines and whatnot.
Like the one back there, that's probably equal in price to a good Daytona, and the 7-liter next to it may be worth more than a Daytona.
A Daytona, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I remember back in the day, oh my God, a Daytona was kind of like it.
Oh, yeah.
Because
way above the rest.
Yeah, 175 mile an hour car. We never thought anything would be faster because of the oil crisis and then all the regulations, EPA and DOT regulations that came in that were strangling everything and keeping the real cool stuff away from us.
And when they finally bought a Daytona, and I tried to actually drive it as a daily car. I was keeping it in Florida for my winter car down when I was living in Florida in the winters. I actually found that it wasn't a great city car. It was a real GT car because it had heavy steering, heavy shift that you had to have warmed up before it worked well. Short doors, difficult to get in and out of. I really was very disappointed in it as a daily driver for me. And then when a girlfriend came to visit from California, and as we pulled into the lot where my boat was, and the car was parked in front of the boat, and she asked me about the Range Rover I was driving. I said, no, it belongs to a friend. I borrowed it to pick you up because I knew you'd have luggage, and my car doesn't hold any real luggage. Because the Daytona had a second air conditioner in the trunk because of Florida.
Oh, interesting, because that car actually had a pretty good-sized trunk.
Yeah, it did until you put the air conditioner in it. And she said, is that your car? And I said, yeah. I was kind of proud of a nice Ferrari there. She says, you drive a Mustang? No, that's that. Is that a Maverick? She got me on that one.
How long did she last?
I still know her today.
Oh.
So still a good friend out in L.A.
Yeah, so she by far
was
outlasted
hilarious.
the Daytona. That's pretty funny.
So my Daytona went. I was already disappointed driving it. It just wasn't good in traffic.
No.
That's what I'm trying to say, I guess. Whereas the ISO you could drive in traffic.
Yes.
It was light. The clutch was light. Everything. The steering, even though it didn't have power steering, it just wasn't that heavy, in spite of having a big lump of an engine above it. So,
and visibility was good. Comfort was good. It's just
they really were just a nice car. Seats comfortable. Whoever designed the interior just did a great job. So that was one of the problems I've had with Intermechanicas over the years. I've had a few Intermechanicas, and I've always liked their cars, but they never seemed to do the interiors where they had any good ergonomics.
Well, case in point is your big block Indra.
Oh, terrible interior. Yeah.
You know what was interesting about that, though, was because I drove that car long before you had it.
Mm-hmm.
And so this car was supposed to be a 428 Cobra Jet in this sleek-looking Italian car most of the Indras had a 351 at that time. And
no, most of them actually had a.
it was a Chevy 350.
No, they had the
Opel,
the stuff from Germany.
Yeah, the Opel 6-cylinder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But they did make it with a Chevy small block as well.
Yeah. You know something, speaking of that, we need to go after that Intermechanic Indra Spider.
Convertible, I know.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember that guy's name.
Oh, God.
He's in Scottsdale. I had his card. Maybe I still do somewhere.
Yeah, well, okay, we got to dig that dude up because that was a very cool car.
And a nice one. And one of the very few, I was told by Ed Waterman that was one of the only ones with a 5-speed.
Yes.
So most of them had automatics.
That's, 4-speed or an automatic.
Or 4-speed.
As a matter of fact, it was the only one with a 5-speed.
That's what it was. It was the only one.
One of one. and just a smoking cool looking thing.
Yeah, that straight six put out pretty good horsepower, certainly for a two-seater car. It'd be fine.
Yeah.
You know.
But with your car, what was interesting, because I remember driving it, here you've got this thing supposed to be monster horsepower, big-ass V8, and it would flatten out about 3,000, 3,500 RPM, and it wouldn't go any higher than that when you were seriously on it.
Oh, it ran terribly. And when we finally took it apart to restore it, we discovered that there was only a few parts that were actually the Cobra jet engine. The block was.
Yep.
The intake manifold wasn't. The heads were from a police interceptor 391 or something. They made it of parts that they had.
Yes.
For a big block apparently sitting around Intermechanica, and then called it the Cobra jet because they were hoping to sell some. And then they showed it. That was the whole point of it. They showed it at a number of auto shows around Europe. And they got some orders, but they never had any money to build any more of them.
But you were able to, it was kind of crazy how you were able to figure out why it wouldn't rev that high.
Oh, well.
And it was almost by happenstance.
Yeah, when they put it together, I mean, they hadn't figured out things like, the gas pedal in relation to getting all the rods by the time you get up there to open the carburetor all the way. It opened the carburetor about 2/3 of the way. That was it.
Yeah.
And that it wasn't anything wrong. It was solid linkage. So we had to change the whole linkage. The exhaust rattled. It hit everywhere. The headers hit. The exhaust. It was like they put the exhaust in and didn't care if it ever ran. So it took a lot of work to straighten it out. And when I had it all straightened out, I don't know if you remember, I brought it out to Phoenix.
Yeah.
We did a road test and an article on it, and it still didn't run great. It still wasn't anything.
But the trick was, if I'm remembering correctly, is because you had this big-ass engine under this sleek, low hood.
We couldn't get air.
That's exactly right.
Yes, you're right. It was air. We also had an air problem. We
Yeah.
couldn't get airflow in it, yes.
And then you figured it out when one day the hood was unlatched or something, and it ran
better.
great.
Yes. I think the hood popped while I was on the freeway, and it picked up speed. I hadn't done anything. And I thought, whoa, this is nice. And then I think it was Bob Dempsey that you were talking about before. It worked for me for many years when I had the restoration shop. He figured it out when I told him what happened. He said, well, you're not getting enough air. Let's take the air cleaner off and see what, So we ended up with a much modified air cleaner.
I remember you were thinking about making another hood for the car, just with an air intake.
That's what it needed.
Yes.
But they didn't do that, and I didn't do it either.
No.
And eventually, I realized the car I could re-engineer it and re-engineer it and re-engineer it. And I'm really doing what they should have done in the first place.
Yes.
For what? I'm just doing it to one car. I'm not going to build any more of them. So I figured I better get rid of it now. And it was all restored. So any engineering I did now was going to hurt my restoration I had done on it.
Yeah.
We painted it. We had upholstered it. It came out as a beautiful looking car. And it was relatively fast in a straight line, but it just never handled well. I don't know if that was their suspension or it couldn't take the weight of the big block on the front end.
I'm going to assume it was probably the weight.
I think the weight distribution was terrible.
But also, to your point, Intermechanic was really operating on a shoestring back then.
Oh, yeah. They were in trouble by then. I think they were starting to make Porsche bodies.
The Porsche replicas.
Yeah, the Porsche Speedster replicas. And that kept them alive for a while, and that was about it.
Anything interesting in the garage these days?
Oh, usual handful. I've got a Ferrari 456 that I like. That's nice. An XKE that was restored. So it's just classic car. I mean, nobody ever did anything like that before or since. And of course, I have a Citroen SM. That's here at the shop being worked on right now, being repainted. And oh gosh, what else have I got here? I got an Austin Healey 3000 and a Mercedes 190 SL, and I think that's it. And 2 Jaguar XK8s in Florida that I actually drive. So you have to have one for each foot because that's the way they run. You know.
You on the hunt for anything? Anything you've got your eye on?
Nothing in particular. I keep my eye open just to see what comes up. I mean, I pretty much had everything, so it's a question of what do I find that's interesting and priced right, and it can be fun.
And what's interesting is you hear a lot of people say, "I've had everything." No, they haven't. This guy's had just about everything.
I've had everything old. I haven't had everything modern, of course, but I've had everything that was built in the day when I was growing up and when I was admiring them.
And when it was interesting and affordable.
Yeah. Today it would be hard to do that with the cars today because they start so high priced.
And there's just not that much that's that really interesting.
That's very true. Very true.
Well, bud, we were blessed to grow up when we did, where we did.
I couldn't agree more. That was fun. It's still fun going to Pebble every year and doing seeing the cars every single year, the whole week there.
Okay, we're going to have to do another podcast because we didn't even get to talk about judging at Pebble or any of that type of stuff.
Sure. Well, can't do it all in one podcast.
There we go. So I think on that note, we'll make it a wrap. Matt, thanks so much for the use of the facility. And thanks so much for joining us on this podcast. And we're looking forward to seeing you on the road or back at home. Thanks so much.